It was the autumn of 1987 when Callie Tanner found herself standing in the middle of 840 acres of eastern Kansas wheat ground with nothing but a bad harvest behind her, a broken combine in the shed, and a note on the kitchen table that read, simply, "I can't do this anymore. Preston." She was 27 years old. The note was still on the table 3 days later. She hadn't moved it, not because she was sentimental about it, but because she hadn't found a reason to go back into the kitchen for anything other than coffee. And she drank that standing at the sink, looking out the window at the field her grandfather had broken sod on in 1931. The morning light hit the stubble in a way that made the ground look like it was sleeping. She had always loved that about October in Kansas. The land rested in October. It didn't ask anything of you. Everything else, however, was asking quite a lot. Let me tell you about the world Callie Tanner had inherited, because without understanding it, you can't understand her. Her grandfather, Otto Tanner, had come to Barton County from western Nebraska with $40, a team of mules, and a stubbornness that his neighbors called foolishness right up until they called it wisdom. He had broken that ground by hand. He had lost one crop to drought, another to grasshoppers, and a third to a hailstorm so fierce it stripped the bark from the fence posts. He had never borrowed more than he could pay back in a single season. His one standing rule, written nowhere but lived every single day, was this: you do not bet the land. His son, Callie's father, Gene, had kept that rule. Gene Tanner had farmed the same 840 acres without a single operating loan he couldn't service. He drove the same green pickup for 14 years. He fixed his own equipment, kept his own records, and taught his daughter to do the same. Starting from the summer she turned 9, when he handed her a grease gun and showed her the correct way to pack a wheel bearing. Gene Tanner died of a heart attack in March of 1985, 2 weeks before planting. He was 58 years old, and he went fast, which was, his neighbors said, the way he would have wanted it. What he left behind was the land, a modest farmhouse with a new water heater and an old roof, 3 pieces of aging equipment in decent running shape, and a locked metal box that contained the farm's financial records going back 30 years. Every payment, every repair, every fuel receipt, written in his careful, compressed hand in a series of spiral notebooks, stacked in the bottom of the box like sedimentary layers of a life. Preston had come into Callie's life 6 months after her father's funeral, introduced by a mutual friend at a harvest dinner in town. He was from Wichita, worked in ag equipment sales, and he was charming in the way that men who don't know hard work can sometimes be charming. All confidence and easy smiles, no calluses on his hands. He had ideas about the farm, big ones. The late 1980s were still riding the tail of the expansion gospel, and Preston believed in it the way a convert believes in anything new, completely without examination. He thought Otto Tanner's philosophy was quaint. He thought Gene Tanner had died, leaving money on the table. He wanted to buy more ground, finance a new combine, plant fence row to fence row, and leverage the operation into something real. Callie listened. She was grieving. She was tired. There is a particular vulnerability that comes with losing a parent and an inheritance in the same season, and Preston had found it without trying very hard. They married in the spring of 1986. By late 1987, with one bad harvest compounded by Preston's operating loan for the new planter he'd insisted on, and a combine that threw a cylinder head 2 weeks into cutting, the cracks had become chasms. The note on the table was not a surprise. It was, if Callie was honest with herself, a relief. But a relief is not a solution. And Callie Tanner was left with the solution part entirely on her own. The first call came from Mr. Aldrich at First National in Great Bend. He was polite, as bankers always are when they are about to deliver bad news in a nice office. He asked if she could come in at her convenience, which meant immediately, which meant the next morning, which meant she drove 40 minutes into town in her dead father's truck with a knot in her stomach the size of a fist. Mr. Aldrich was a compact man in his early 60s with a gray mustache and the kind of careful, deliberate movements that spoke of a man accustomed to watching other people's lives unravel from behind a desk. He had known her father. He said so, in the way people say it when they want to establish that they are not unkind before they say something that will feel unkind regardless. Gene was a good farmer and a careful man, Mr. Aldrich began, his hands folded on the desk in front of him. You know I respected him. I know, Callie said. The operating note your husband took out in February. The bank is reviewing its position on that loan given the circumstances. He paused, and with the combine down, the harvest shortfall, and your, change in domestic situation. We have to be realistic about the spring season. She waited. She had learned that from her father, too. Let the other person say the whole thing. There's been some interest in this ground, Callie. From outside investors. Corporate ag. They've been approaching a number of families in the county, and frankly, they're offering prices that reflect more than the land's current production value. He leaned forward slightly. You'd walk away clear. No debt, a fresh start somewhere. She looked at him for a long moment. Out the window behind his head, she could see the water tower at the edge of town, the one they'd painted with the county fair logo back when she was in high school. I'm not selling, she said. Mr. Aldrich absorbed this the way a man absorbs unwelcome news when he was expecting it. He recalibrated. He set his hands flat on the desk. Callie, the combine alone, you're looking at a repair bill that may not make economic sense given its age. And the spring crop will go in, she said. The loan will be serviced. How? He asked, and it was a fair question, and she didn't resent him for it. You don't have the capital for a custom harvester crew come June, and you can't bring in 840 acres alone. I won't need a custom crew, she said. Give me until spring. He studied her for a moment, then he picked up his pen and made a note on the pad in front of him. Whatever he wrote, he didn't show her. 3 months, he said. We'll revisit in January. She drove home on the county road with the truck windows down despite the cold, because she needed the air. The October fields stretched flat and still on both sides of her. A red-tailed hawk sat on a fence post and watched her pass. She thought about what she'd just said to Mr. Aldrich. The spring crop will go in. The loan will be serviced. And she turned the words over in her mind to see if she believed them. She thought she did. She wasn't certain, but she thought so. The combine was the first problem. The Gleaner K2 was a 1976 machine her father had bought used in 1981 and maintained with the same devotion he gave everything mechanical. When the cylinder head cracked 2 weeks into harvest, it had stopped with 1,500 acres worth of work still left in the season. Her father's service records told her it had never thrown ahead before. The engine hours were high, but the maintenance log was immaculate. Every oil change, every belt, every bearing, documented in that compressed handwriting. Let me stop here, because this is the part that people outside of farming don't understand. They see broken machinery and they see a bill. They see a number that is either payable or it isn't. What they don't see is the thing that Callie Tanner saw, which was information. Broken equipment is a problem, but a problem has a cause. A cause has a solution. The solution has a cost, and cost is the last thing you figure out, not the first. She spent 2 days reading, not novels. She read the Gleaner Service Manual. All 460 pages of it, the binding cracked and soft from her father's handling, alongside every entry in his maintenance notebooks that mentioned the K2. She cross-referenced the cylinder head failure with the engine hours, and the last valve adjustment. She found what she was looking for in a note her father had written in pencil in the margin of a July 1984 entry. Check head torque specs after extended dry weather running. Manual says 85 feet elb. I do 82 in summer. She took that note to Roy Siebert at Siebert Implement over in Ellenwood, a man who had been working on combines since before Callie was born and who had the kind of hands that looked like they'd been sculpted out of engine grease and stubbornness. She showed him the margin note. He read it twice. Your daddy caught something the factory specs didn't account for, Roy said, turning the notebook over in his big hands with a kind of reverence. Thermal expansion in dry summer conditions. The head was fighting the torque for 3 seasons before it gave. Can we resurface it? She asked. He looked at her, not with surprise exactly, but with a recalibration. The same kind Mr. Aldrich had done, but Roy Siebert's version was warmer. Resurface and retorque to your daddy's spec, he said. I'll need 2 weeks and about $400 in machine shop time. He paused. Most people would just buy a used engine. Cost more, but it's easier to explain to yourself. I'm not interested in what's easier to explain, Callie said. I'm interested in what works. Roy looked at her for another moment, and then he said, Your daddy talked about you sometimes, when he'd bring equipment in. Said you were the only one of his kids who ever actually listened. She drove home with the notebook on the passenger seat beside her. The weeks that followed were a curriculum she had not enrolled in and could not drop. She was farming alone now, truly alone. No husband underfoot with his opinions and his loan applications. No father to call when the tractor acted up. There was a neighbor, Bud Ostergaard, who farmed the quarter section to the south, and who brought over a pan of his wife's bars the second week of October without explanation, set them on the porch rail, and left without knocking. She ate those bars for 4 days and thought about how people show up for each other out here without making a production of it. She filed that away. The planter Preston had bought on credit was a problem. It was newer than anything else on the operation, which meant it was also more complicated, and the loan against it was eating cash she didn't have. She drove to 3 implement auctions in November and watched prices carefully. She was not yet buying. She was learning the market the way her grandfather had learned weather patterns. Not because any individual data point told you anything, but because the pattern told you everything. She made herself keep the notebooks. Every day she wrote down what she'd done, what she'd fixed, what she'd noticed. It felt strange at first, like she was performing her father's habits without understanding them. But by December, she understood. The notebook wasn't record-keeping. It was a conversation with her future self. It was leaving information for the person who would need it next season, next decade, in the margin of some crisis not yet imagined. There was a night in early January when she almost broke. A freezing rain had coated everything in an inch of ice. The power had been out since the previous afternoon. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a kerosene lamp, the notebook spread out in front of her, trying to work through the spring input costs against what she could realistically expect per bushel. And the numbers kept coming out wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, just persistently, stubbornly short. She could make the loan payment. She could not make the loan payment and pay Roy in full and buy seed and pay the fuel bill that was coming for the field work. She sat there in the cold yellow light, and she let herself feel the full weight of it for a few minutes. The house was silent except for the snap of ice on the windows and the distant sound of something shifting in the cold. A limb, maybe, or a fence post settling. She had not cried since Preston left. She had not cried since her father's funeral, really. She didn't cry now, but she sat with it, which was its own kind of allowance. Then she got up, put on her coat, and went to the workshop. She did not go there for any practical reason. The power was out. She couldn't run any tools. She went because the workshop was her father's space, in the way that the kitchen had been her mother's. A place where his presence was still stored in the organization of the drawers and the smell of the oil and the particular way the tools hung on the pegboard in their outlined places. She took a flashlight and stood in the middle of that cold, dark room and let herself be in it for a while. She was shining the flashlight along the shelf of service manuals when she saw the envelope. It was tucked behind the K2 manual, the corner just visible, a plain white envelope with Callie written on it in her father's handwriting. She stood holding it for a long moment before she opened it. The letter inside was 2 paragraphs, written on a piece of lined paper torn from one of his notebooks. If you're reading this, something happened and the farm came to you. I don't know what shape it's in by now. Probably not perfect. Land never is. I want you to know one thing. Everything you need is already on this place. The knowledge is in the manuals. The memory is in the notebooks. The strength is in you. I know that last one for certain because I watched you grow up. Don't let anyone tell you what this land is worth to them. The only worth that matters is what it means to you. Do the work. Trust the ground. The rest will come. She read it twice. She folded it back into the envelope and tucked it into the front pocket of her coat against her chest. Then she went back inside and did the math again. The third time through, she found the margin she'd missed. If she sold the new planter at auction and replaced it with an older machine, she could buy outright for half the proceeds. She cleared enough to cover Roy and the seed and leave herself a thin cushion for fuel. It wasn't comfort, but it was solvency. She called Bud Ostergaard the next morning and asked if he'd be willing to trade a week of her labor in the spring, fence work, whatever he needed, for the use of his drill to get her winter wheat in late. He said yes without hesitating, and she could hear his wife say something in the background, and he said, "She's doing it herself, Loretta, same as Jean would have," and Callie held the phone against her ear and breathed for a moment. The spring planting went in 2 weeks behind schedule due to wet ground, which made her nervous, but the wheat came up clean and even. She drove the county road every morning at first light in April just to watch it. There is something about a field greening up after winter that is almost unreasonably hopeful. It doesn't know what you went through to plant it. It just comes. The town was watching. She knew it. She'd catch it in the grain elevator sometimes, a pause in conversation when she walked in, a certain careful friendliness, the feed store, the co-op. People were kind, but they were holding their breath on her behalf, and she could feel it. They thought of her situation as temporary. She was either going to sell or she was going to fail, and they weren't sure which they expected to see first. They were watching the wrong thing. What they weren't watching was the soil. Her grandfather had wrested that ground the right way for decades, rotating crops, leaving stubble, never pushing it beyond what it could give back. Her father had continued it. 3 years of Callie's management had added something else, a level of attention that expressed itself in small ways. She caught a nitrogen deficiency on the south quarter in early May by the color of the emerging crop, a pale yellowing that meant intervention 2 weeks ahead of where most of her neighbors would have noticed it. She didn't spend money on a soil consultant. She spent 2 evenings with her father's notebooks and the county extension bulletins he'd filed, in a manila folder marked Soil Reference, in the bottom drawer of the workshop filing cabinet. Callie Tanner went into the 1988 harvest with a reconditioned combine, a paid operating loan, and wheat that was running 4 bushels per acre, better than the county average on ground. Her neighbors said was too tired to perform. She brought in the crop in 9 days with Roy Siebert, spelling her in the cab for 2 afternoons when her back finally gave out from the hours. She paid him in cash, and in a casserole her neighbor, Loretta Ostergaard, had pressed on her at the beginning of harvest, which Roy received with the seriousness it deserved. Now let me tell you about 1989, because that is when the storm hit. The crisis that had been building in American agriculture since the mid-1980s was not invisible to anyone who was paying attention. The interest rates that had climbed to strangle the farm economy earlier in the decade had begun to ease, but the damage was done. The farmers who had taken on debt in the expansion years, the ones buying bigger, borrowing more, convinced that commodity prices would stay strong, were in foreclosure. The banks that had pressed those loans were now pressing them in the other direction, calling notes, demanding collateral reassessment, showing up at farms with paperwork that meant the same thing a drought meant, just slower. By 1989, the county looked different. Drive any section road, and you'd see it. For sale signs that stayed up too long, then disappeared, and were replaced by the white notices of sheriff's sales. A neighbor to the north, a man named Dale, who had farmed 1,000 acres with 2 sons and the most debt load in the township, lost everything in 18 months. His equipment went at auction on a Tuesday in October. Callie went to the auction not to buy, but because she believed you owed a witness to a man's life's work going on the block in a field on a cold morning. She stood in the back of the crowd and watched the combine go for 40 cents on the dollar. She thought about her own K2, reconditioned and running clean in the shed at home. She drove back without stopping. Her farm did not tremble. That's the only way to say it. The land that had been farmed without debt for 60 years did not tremble when the debt farming world collapsed around it. Her operating costs were low. Her inputs were covered by the previous year's harvest. She owed Mr. Aldrich at First National a modest line of credit she'd opened in the spring, and it was half paid down already. She was not getting rich, she was surviving, and in the Kansas farm crisis of 1989, survival was the only kind of victory that counted. The spring of 1990 brought a visitor she wasn't expecting. Mr. Aldrich came out himself. He didn't call ahead. She saw his Buick coming down the long gravel drive on a Saturday morning in April when she was already in the field checking soil moisture. She drove back in the truck and met him in the yard, her boots muddy and her jacket smelling of diesel. He stood at the edge of the driveway, hands in his coat pockets, and looked out at the field she'd just come from. The winter wheat was already 6 inches tall and a particular shade of dark green that only comes with healthy soil. He stood there for a full minute without saying anything. "I've driven by here a few times this winter," he said finally. "Your wheat last fall." He shook his head. "Better stand than anyone in the county." "It was a good season," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said quietly. "It wasn't. Not for anyone else." He took a breath. He was a man in his mid-60s now, and the crisis years had taken something out of him. Callie had heard from Roy Sieber that Mr. Aldrich had lost sleep over the foreclosures, that he'd agonized over the loans he'd approved in the expansion years, that he held himself partially responsible for what had happened to his neighbors. "I came to tell you something," he said. "When you sat across from me in October of '87, I thought I was seeing a young woman in over her head." He paused. "I was wrong about what I was seeing. I was seeing Gene Tanner's daughter, and I should have recognized that from the start." He met her eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't offer you more trust when you needed it." Callie had been holding a handful of soil she'd taken from the field, the way her father used to do, just to feel it, to know what you were working with. She turned it over in her palm. "My father didn't need the bank to believe in him," she said. "He just needed the bank to stay out of his way." Mr. Aldrich absorbed this. Then slowly he smiled, not a professional smile, A real one, the kind that takes a moment to arrive. He reached out his hand. She looked down at her own. The dirt, the cracked knuckles, the grease that never fully came out of the seam by her thumb, and she shook his hand. 6 weeks later, a pickup truck she recognized turned into the long driveway. She was on the combine platform checking belt tension when she heard it. She stayed where she was and watched Preston Tanner, who had gone back to being Preston Hollis the moment the divorce was final, get out and stand in the yard. He looked at the farm. He looked at it the way you look at something you misunderstood when you had the chance to understand it. She came down from the machine, wiped her hands, and stood on the ground in front of him. The April sun was warm on the back of her neck. The wheat was electric green out past the shed. He had aged. He was 34 now, and the oil field work he'd gone to in Oklahoma had put lines in his face that hadn't been there. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by something more accurate but less comfortable. "I heard things turned around out here," he said. He couldn't quite look directly at her. "Things were always pointed in the right direction," she said. "We just disagreed about which way that was." He was quiet for a moment. His hands were in his pockets, same as Mr. Aldrich had stood. She wondered if all men stood that way when they came to say hard things. "I was so sure," he said, "that the old way was the wrong way. That your dad's approach was, I used to think it was fear. Afraid to grow, afraid to risk." He looked at the field. "I know now it wasn't fear. It was the opposite of fear. He wasn't afraid of losing. He just didn't need to win in the way I thought winning looked." He finally looked at her directly. "I treated you like you were holding the farm back," he said. "I know now you were the only thing holding it together." He swallowed. "I'm sorry, Callie, for the loan and for leaving and for not seeing what was right in front of me for 2 years. She looked at him for a long moment. The apology was real. She could tell because it cost him something. And he said it anyway. "Okay," she said. "I hear you." She didn't invite him in, and he didn't expect her to. He nodded once, got back in his truck, and drove back down the gravel road. She watched the dust settle after him, and then she turned and walked back to the combine. That was 2 apologies in 6 weeks. It settled something she hadn't known she was waiting to have settled. The anger she'd been keeping in a low, banked fire since October of 1987 went cool. Not because of what they'd said, exactly, but because they'd seen it, finally. The land had made the argument for her, patient and undeniable. "Let me bring you forward now. Not a little. A long way. 30 years, more or less. Callie Tanner is in her late 50s, and she still farms the same 840 acres in Barton County, Kansas. She added a quarter section in 2001, bought outright, with cash from 3 years of careful accumulation. She never took on operating debt again after 1988. She drives a truck that is 11 years old and runs perfectly because she keeps it that way. The farmhouse has a new roof, 2 new roofs. Actually, the first put on in 1996 and replaced again in 2019. The workshop is essentially unchanged from her father's time, except that the shelf of service manuals now extends the full length of the east wall, and there is a second filing cabinet, her own, where she keeps her notebooks. 37 of them now, 1 for each season, since she took over the farm alone. The K2 combine is gone. She sold it in 1998 after the resale value peaked and bought a newer machine with the proceeds plus cash, no financing. She keeps a photograph of the K2 on the workshop wall, next to her grandfather's photograph and her father's. It is the only decoration in the room that isn't a tool. Roy Sieber retired in 2009 and gave her his personal set of Gleaner service manuals, the ones he'd annotated over 40 years of repairs. They are on her shelf now, their pages soft as cloth. She told his wife at the retirement party that those manuals were worth more than anything else in the workshop, and she meant it. People come to see her now, not many, but regularly. Young farmers, some of them fresh out of K-State's ag program, with degrees in precision farming and soil science, who have heard from someone that the Tanner place in Barton County has been farming the same ground profitably for 90 years without a foreclosure and without a year of operating debt since 1988. They come expecting wisdom about technology or markets or crop insurance. She talks to them about soil. She talks to them about the difference between farming land and mining it. She talks to them about patience and about the way a field communicates if you're quiet enough to hear it. She talks to them about the notebook in their truck. She tells every single one of them to start a notebook. Today, not a spreadsheet, a notebook, something they can hold and pass on. One afternoon last October, her nephew Owen came out from Wichita to spend a weekend. He is 22, studying agricultural business, interested in coming back to the county, not sure if it makes sense. She took him to the workshop. She opened the filing cabinet and showed him her notebooks. And beside them, in a fireproof metal box, her father's notebooks, and beside those, the letter she had found behind the service manual on the night the power went out in 1988. Owen read the letter. He read it twice, the same way she had. "He wrote this before anything happened?" Owen asked. "He didn't know you'd need it?" "He knew I might," she said. "That's different." She took him out to the North Quarter, where she'd been doing some tile work that fall, and showed him the profile of the soil in the wall of the drainage cut. The topsoil was dark and deep, 8 inches in some spots, in ground that had been continuously cropped for 9 decades. He crouched down and looked at it. "How?" he asked. "Every place around here. The topsoil's gone from row crop pressure." She handed him a clump of it. He held it the way people hold things they don't entirely understand, but can tell are significant. "You don't take more than the land can give back," she said. "And you don't borrow against the future to pay for the present. My grandfather understood that. My father understood it." She looked at the field. "It's not complicated. It's just hard to believe because everyone around you is always doing the opposite." Owen turned the soil over in his hands. "What do I do?" he asked. "To start, buy a notebook," she said. "Write down what you do and what you see and what doesn't work. Leave it somewhere someone can find it." She looked out at the field, the same field her grandfather had broken in 1931, the same ground her father had walked behind a mule, the same soil she had gambled everything on in the winter of 1987, when she was 27 years old and alone, and not entirely certain she was right, but certain enough to stay. The land was darker than it had ever been. The earthworms had come back. The moisture held 3 days longer after a rain than it did on the neighboring ground. It wasn't visible from the road. You had to know to look for it. But it was there. The men who had told her to sell, the banker, the husband, the whole quiet consensus of a community that could not imagine a woman alone managing what a man had managed. They had seen a problem to be liquidated, a liability, a burden without a solution. What they had failed to see was the ground itself, the ground that had been cared for by 3 generations of people who understood that the land is not a commodity. It is a relationship. You bring patience to it. You bring knowledge to it. You bring your father's notebooks and your grandfather's stubbornness and the letter you found on the worst night of your life. You bring all of that and you give it time, and the land, which has a memory longer than any of us, gives it back. Callie Tanner had not defeated anyone. She had simply stayed. She had done the work when the work was the only answer available. And the ground, which does not care about bank loans or oil field booms or the opinions of men in pressed shirts, had done what ground does when it is treated right. It had kept its end of the bargain.